Hello and welcome to another End User Talk podcast. I'm your hostess, Jamila, your Lady in Tech. Hello and welcome to the End User Talk podcast. I'm your hostess, Jamila, your Lady in Tech. Today, we have another wonderful guest sharing their journey with us. We have Leila Grace, and I want to welcome you and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet and talk with me today.
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. No problem. It's been my pleasure. Well, what I would like to do before we get started, do you mind giving us a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah. My name's Leila Grace. I am from Austin, Texas. I am the Culture and Arts Education Manager with the Asian American Resource Center. That's what I do during my day job. But other than that, when I'm not working, I'm very much still plugged into what I do during my 9 to 5. I'm like a local community member. I do a lot of work in the community. And yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. You know what? Sometimes it's hard to separate our personal lives from our professional lives. They kind of get intertwined. So I definitely understand. Well, honestly, I guess, you know what? Why don't we start here? How did your journey start? How did you get to this point?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a windy road, but in retrospect, not too windy. I ended up in Austin because I went to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin. I got my master's in women's and gender studies. And originally I had hopes and dreams of, going and getting my PhD and becoming a professor and, getting my tenure. And I kind of had a heart-to-heart conversation with a professor my first year of grad school, and just kind of learning about just how difficult the academic institutions could be. I made the decision that, I was just going to get my master's, get in, get out, and then and figure out what I was going to do afterwards. And one of the things that drew me to grad school was I always wanted to, I guess, make an impact with students and their lives in the way that I felt like I was impacted when I was in undergrad. And after going through grad school at UT, I realized that I would make a bigger impact in the community. So I decided to go into nonprofit. So after grad school, I was in nonprofit for several years, local nonprofits here in Austin. One of them is it's Asian American nonprofit for survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. So it's specifically to provide services to folks who are survivors and from the refugee and immigrant community as well. So I did that for several years, but specifically I was in, of all things, fundraising. Applied for an admin job at that nonprofit. But of course, you do an admin job at a nonprofit, you just really wear many hats. So, volunteer coordination, fundraising, event planning, community outreach. And then I left that, worked at a different nonprofit, and then found my way to the Asian American Resource Center. And I've only been there for about a year, literally at the start of the pandemic. But I really enjoy it. I think it's one of those, I talked to several people, and it's my journey kind of led me, I think, to where I'm at, where I am kind of actually doing what I set out to do when I went to grad school, which is, make an impact in the community.
Well, I think that is very noble of you. And you know what, in all honesty, it's navigating the things that you want to do when you become an adult. As a child, we have this idea, that, oh, I want to do this and I want to do that. And you feel very passionate about it. And then you get into high school and you start meeting different people and you're exploring and being exposed to so many different things. And then you graduate from high school. And if you are an individual that takes the path of going off to college and studying whatever it is that you intend on studying, once again, you're meeting new people. You're having these discussions and, your parents and you all decided, what, this is what you're going to do. This is your path. But in this journey and in this, it's actually a rediscovery, when you're meeting all of these people and they're telling you what they're studying and you're going to you're talking to your professors and you're learning all of these new things and you're like, well, maybe this isn't what I wanted to do, or maybe this isn't what I'm intended to do. You join organizations, you start doing volunteer work and you see that there's a need somewhere else and you have this thing that used to be your passion or maybe your plan, not necessarily your passion, but your plan. After being exposed and having all these different conversations and meeting all these people who appear to be doing these very great, impactful things, you decide, you know what, maybe I want to do the same thing. And you try to decide, you know what, should I continue on this degree path? Because you talk to some people are like, look, you generally have to have a plan B, right, to your A. They'll tell you, you know what, focus, finish that. It's just good to have the degree. And then you can pursue this plan B.
This thing on the side, like
exactly.
Once you have your degree in your pocket. And I, as I grew older, I used to believe that was the case as well. But looking back at my own experience, I was like, I never had a plan B. Like what I really had was the plan that I was telling my parents I was on. And then there was the plan that I was like, oh, I'm just gonna figure it out, because the more I learned about what I wanted to do, the more I was like, this isn't the best fit for me. And, you talked about in high school. In high school, I thought I was going to be a lawyer. I went to a lawyer summer camp at Stanford because I was like, this is my path. This is what I'm going to do. And then I thought I was going to go into fashion design and, go into the fashion industry. And I had dreams of going to New York to study fashion design. And I even, I always think about that was the path I never went down, because I did apply to Paulson's and I got in and I was going to go. And my mom vividly remember her doing this, ripping my admission letter, because she just was like, you're not going to go to some no-name art school. And I was like, this is the top one in the country and I have a full ride. And, I just went back on that path of okay, well, clearly I can't tell my parents what I really want to do. So I'll just tell them something and then figure it out on the side. So for the longest time, for years, I told them I was going to law school, and my mom still calls me and is like, it's never too late to apply to go get your JD. And I'm like, maybe one day. But I'm still telling my mom maybe one day I'd go to law school, but never once did I consider going to law school. It was always something I think I eventually was like, oh, this is just something I'll tell my parents so I could figure out what I really want to do. Just thinking about my experience going through university and how I thought for the longest time, oh, this is where I'm going to make the most impact. I want to make an impact among students. And I realized later on that, it's not just university students that need conversations about culture and identity and all these things that get talked about at the university level, at the university campus, right? I think it's very much a need that's, I think, needed outside of the academic realm. And I'm seeing this a lot, sitting in like community meetings and meeting people. I think it's just such a need. And, when I remember being in grad school, and it was always talked about how all of this information will make its way out into the community and whatnot. And that was like a decade ago, and I'm still seeing it, it still hasn't made its way out, even though we talk about so much on social media. I'm still seeing it in community members. They still need like the space to have these difficult conversations about their identity, about dealing with, just different aspects of themselves that they just never had the opportunity to discuss or process.
You know what do you think makes that such a difficult conversation to have?
I think that it depends, everyone has different reasons why they haven't, unearthed the conversations about, let's say, like the intersection of like race and gender, for example, right? I think one part is like survival. A lot of folks they just don't have the time or energy to think about these things because they were busy doing other things just to, better themselves, better their lives, better their families. I hear that a lot from folks. Is like it's a lot of heavy work, I think, to do that kind of identity work. Because you realize a lot of tough things that are like really hard, and to realize that in the spot also without any like safety net, especially students are able to do this work at the university level, and you have like all these safety nets, right? You have like mental health services, student unions, like all these like different organizations, but you don't really have that out in the community. So folks aren't able to process that stuff safely. They aren't able to like go and have these conversations in a like elsewhere in a very constructive manner. I think there's, again, just different reasons why, like culturally, maybe it's not a thing. Either like with my parents, but they'll just kind of like, why bother thinking about these things? There's more important things to think about.
Yeah, and I definitely can see that. And you also have this thing where people feel as though it's not someone else's, outside of the family unit. It's not anyone else's responsibility to teach about race relations.
Yeah.
We make those things available at the college or university level because I believe there is an intersection there, as you stated, because now you've got all of these people from different parts of the world, different countries, different socio-economical backgrounds, different upbringings, different cultures, different practices even. You got all of these people in one space, and all of these people are sitting in one class or course. And you've got to find some means of being able to have these individuals work together and in some way, form, or fashion be empathetic or be able to relate to one another so that we all are, I guess, able to learn whatever this is. Because you can't, when you're in a class, you can't say, I don't want to be in a class with this person. We have to find a way to meld or our differences and put them aside for, I guess, the hour that we're in this lecture.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Yeah. Like, I think like in the classroom setting is such a structured setting, right? And then also you're able to leave when the class is over. You could leave and walk out versus, trying to have these conversations, like, let's say with your family members, you don't get to leave that conversation. It keeps coming back up. And you make these decisions. Do I keep having these conversations that are mentally exhausting for me and perhaps even for family members? Or do you just stop, right? And, I think like a lot of folks do make that decision. And again, I also do think that when it comes to talking about like racial identity and like how that intersects with different levels and aspects of our identity. It is a lot to unpack, because it's not isolated to single events. They happen in various bits and pieces throughout your life. And, I always think about kind of the moments in which I recognize, that moment I didn't really maybe I didn't give too much thought, but always rubbed me a certain way. And I look back at it and then seeing how it fits in the grand scheme of things in terms of systemically, systemic racism or gendered violence and whatnot. There's that intersection that's going on.
And then there's also this thing where it's generational. Like you said, your parents, we don't focus on that. That's just, it is what it is. And it's almost like a mentality of it's not going to change. So why talk about it? There's no discussion for us to have about this. Your opinions don't matter because this is just the way things are. So you have that generation, you have that mindset, and then you have the mindset of people now. I don't know if you call them millennials or Generation X or Gen Zers. These individuals, these groups of individuals are more prone to accepting and I'll say they're willing to hear or listen to the point of view of someone else, whether that's you being, I'm willing to listen to a female explain to me why she thinks that it isn't necessary to have a woman on a board, a woman's point of view, or it doesn't necessarily have to be all racial, but you're able to have the conversation. You're able to have the discussion, even if at the end of the discussion, you all still leave feeling the same way. No decisions have been made. We've been able to express this thing that we felt for so long that has been such a taboo conversation. But now I'm able to express it and get it out of my head. And I'm able to bounce this off of someone else. And then I hear their point of view, their perspective. So I think that, too, is also what makes things so difficult is because you've got these generational differences and mindsets. And, you want to say that people feel like they treat these things as it has to be like a tradition. This is just how things are.
But these were things that were these are previously social contracts, right? These are all social constructs that us as a society agreed was some sort of truth at some point. But that's, I think, because again, a lot of voices were not in the picture or they were being silenced. And so, you talked about there's this younger generation that's a little bit more willing to talk about these things. Although I will say this kind of generalization that the younger generation is going to move the needle forward, that's not necessarily always the case, right? I think there's a lot of folks who from different backgrounds and they might still be not willing to have this conversation or still working through their own journey. I think because this is what I've struggled with, is just this assumption, I'm going to meet someone that's closer to my generation and it's not going to be this struggle. We're going to be able to have this coming together, this it'll be preaching to the choir, and it actually turns out that's not the case at all. I've talked to some friends and whatnot, and it's kind of this past summer, the past year, I think a lot of folks have been a little bit more vocal and they're seeing maybe a little bit more information and testimonies and stories that they may have never came across previously. And that might, and, there was a bit of that awakening going on. But having, talked about issues of race and gender and class and like the intersections that they have with one another. For, not to say I'm an expert, but yeah, I feel like I've been talking about these things for like a decade since I was younger, and then seeing folks finally have this awakening. It's, I have this feeling of like, oh, like finally you're joining the party, right? Finally you're here, like, hey, but then I see, I remember last year I was seeing folks make that similar comment too. Like, oh, all these people are finally jumping on the bandwagon. They're all so late to the conversation. And I'm like, well, I'm glad they are here. Like, and, I'm glad that they're pulling up and they're showing up, and they might not be showing up in the most perfect ways, right? Like they might still be using maybe terminology that's not the best. Their understanding of certain systems might still be like simplistic in some ways, may still be black and white in some ways, still be existing in this like binary that isn't as nuanced as maybe like we might think about things. But at the same time, I'm still kind of glad they're showing up and that they're starting this journey of learning about themselves and learning like how they interact in society. Yeah. Does that make sense? Like
yeah, no, I mean, I understand. It's just, it's kind of like what you said. Systematic is a big, complicated word. Mm-hmm. Systematic is the backbone of, it's the mm-hmm. fiber of a lot of things that were built. And I'm talking about what's going on here in the U.S., only mm-hmm. because that's where I've been all of my life. But, systems are what makes the world go round. It makes things mm-hmm. happen. It makes this chain link fence come together. And I guess the biggest frustration with it is that, the individuals who implemented these systems, they implemented them in order to benefit themselves. Mm-hmm. And they have the ability, they have the authority, they have the power. They also have the influence in order mm-hmm. to dictate how systems are going to work, who it's going to benefit, how mm-hmm. it's going to be put in place. And because these things are so fibered in everything from education to medical, to mm-hmm. our finances, to where we live, who lives in which neighborhoods and how mm-hmm. they live, what's funneled to these neighborhoods. It's such a broad subject matter and construct that even from your individual family unit, whatever your ethnicity is, whatever your background is, there's even a construct that's planted or a seed that's planted there. So to have people now, talking about these differences and these biases and these things that we're going to have to try to change, you have an element of these individuals who don't want it to change because they benefit from it.
Mm-hmm. And there's also folks who might have the misunderstanding that they do benefit from it, right? Like I think very much so about like the model minority myth. For example, I know there's this like right now with what's going on lately in the Asian American community, there's this like, maybe this reckoning with what the model minority myth is. And again, I think like that's part of this like myth building that's going on in terms of like systems of, like systems of oppression that creates like these myths, right? Like these social myths that like, okay, so we all become like complacent in some way to uplift our own oppressions. And the model minority myth is definitely one of them. And like, I hear this from folks, they like are unwilling to let go of the model minority myth because they're thinking, if I am a model citizen, if I do my part, right? Like if I support these systems of oppression, supporting white supremacy in some way or form, I will benefit from it, when really that's not the case. And I think like this past Yeah, seeing very much so how the Asian American community has always been the other, yet at the same time given this moniker of the model minority has really, I think, like highlighted how much that's such a falsehood as well. And, like people don't want to let go again of something they think that is helping them survive, right? Like, again, we were talking earlier about how some folks don't want to have the conversations about their identity, about race and gender and like all these like intersections because of survival. And I think, like ignorance really is bliss. Like if you don't look inward because you're benefiting from whatever is going on, then like why would you look inward? Why would you want to dismantle these cultural myths, right? Like
Exactly.
you don't have any not buy-in, but you don't have any motivation to do so because you're surviving. Like, so I think when I think about like racialized groups, I think it's not because they're benefiting from certain systems. I think that like systems are allowing them to quote unquote survive in ways that makes them survive in a way that's allowing them to be just complacent enough to support, right? To support systems that continue to oppress them. Just because like, hey, I'm surviving, I'm getting through, my kids are able to go to college, I'm able to, support them in these ways, I'm living the American dream. And it's, I think like then like why bother dismantling this myth that's allowing you to survive? Because, I think a lot about like, we're talking about how college really isn't, the end goal for some people. It's not like this idea of like, you're going to start off like with this career and it's going to lead you to A, B, and C. Like that's also a part of like this model minority myth, right? Like all these doctors and lawyers are going to, help uplift the community. But clearly, even despite being doctors and lawyers, they're still being the other. I think back to, like we think about this year, but then there was also that case that happened several years ago on the plane. I'm forgetting the man's name off the top of my head, but you know what I'm talking about? That I wish I could Google it right now. But the case of the doctor that was like attacked on the plane because he didn't want to get off, and then he was dragged.
I do recall what you're talking about. Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. And just like, again, he was a doctor, and then during this whole situation in the news, he was portrayed so much as the other. It didn't matter that he was a doctor. It didn't matter like all these things, like all these accomplishments, right? That like I know my parents would value very much. They all got stripped away from his identity. And, we saw that very similarly to what's just going on in the media, like all these, there was a lot of elders in the community that were being assaulted and harassed. And again, just that's kind of like stripping of like who they are and their narratives, those stories. And those just kind of reduced down to this other being. I think a lot about how with the shooting in Atlanta, like I didn't hear about the victims' personal stories until very later on. And it wasn't until I was like attending a vigil and not all of I know that there was some controversies going on because not the family of some of the victims didn't want any of the information shared. They didn't want any photos. They wanted it to be very private. But the ones that did, those stories were shared. Some of them were shared during this vigil. And it was the first time I had heard some of the stories. And it just like really hit to me how these women were, at the end of the day, in mainstream media, were kind of stripped of their own identity. In a way that, again, plays back, I think, to a lot of certain myth building that happens here in the United States. It's a lot to unpack. Sorry, I'm very in my head.
You know what you're bringing. This is the exact. Okay. What you're lending to or where you're headed is exactly the discussion that Black people or African Americans are trying to bring to the forefront. It's kind of like, it's this construct of like what you're saying. These people had lives. These were people, they were someone's sister, aunt, niece, daughter, mother in some cases. They had a title, but the media will take away the importance of this person's presence or impact to say it's almost like it doesn't matter that they had a life. It doesn't matter that they meant something to someone else because this person had a bad day. You know, you make them sound inhuman, unreal, when they were the true victims. There was a true there were lives lost. Those lives meant something. But because this person, who happened to be Caucasian, we want to bring humanity to this person, and we use words like he had a bad day. Everyone knows what a bad day is, right? You know, we all know what it is to have a bad day. We all know what it's like to be fed up. We all know what it's like to be pushed to the limits. But just like everyone says, okay, yes, I can relate to being pushed to a limit, but I also have self-control. I don't go and slap someone. I don't go and take my vehicle and run it into a crowd of people because I disagree or because I had a bad day.
I think it goes back to, I think, this idea of certain systems of, you know, you were saying earlier, there are people who benefit from certain systems, and that means that they have more space to do things. And I think for marginalized groups, we tend to be given a very, very small space to exist. I kind of want to go back to like what you were talking about with like this kind of like this erasure of the identity, right? So something I was thinking about just now was how, so like I mentioned, I had spent some time working for a nonprofit that helps survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. One thing about survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault is like there's this kind of concept of you go through this traumatic violent act once. I guess I'm speaking specifically about sexual assault, and you go through it once, and then either when you're on trial or when there's a trial or when there's there's media going on about it, you're going through the trauma of it all over again. And I kind of was thinking about like when it came to Atlanta, it's almost as if like in the media, because it was like, oh, he had a bad day. This was about sexism. This wasn't about race. It felt to me as if there was a second death going on in the media because it was denying a part of these women's identity, which was that they were Asian American and that they were Asian immigrants, and that, again, systems of oppression intersect, right? Like you can't just say this was like a misogynistic sexist act. Like this was the intersection of like race and gendered violence. And the fact that, it was kind of like, well, he had a bad day, and the person had like a sex addiction and all these things, and not in the media, just like in mainstream U.S. media in particular, not wanting to name that intersection, I think, again, denies the victims like that part of their identity. I think like reduces them down and creates like, again, like, and to me, what felt like a second death. Like I know when I was seeing the media reports, I don't know, it was a lot to just see that be completely not like acknowledged in the media. It felt like I felt in like as if it was like erasing myself.
Right. And the thing about this is it almost gives license to a particular group of individuals, and it makes them inflate this idea that they are superior. It gives them license that we can do whatever we want. These other people do not matter, because they've set this construct that there is a sense of supremacy. We're here. No one else can supersede that. And they make all of the excuses. So just like you said, you clearly stated that, why would I change something? I'm not bothered. None of this affects me. I get to fly under the radar, and I can do whatever I want. There's no consequence. There's no repercussions. As a matter of fact, I don't even have to come up with my own defense, because everybody else will pity me. They will defend me. They will make an excuse for me. So I don't even have to be honest or accountable, because I've got this systematic, this thing that's systematically placed for me, and allows me this control. And anybody who doesn't look like me or is on the same plane as I am, they're all just, they're just, I don't want to say victims, but they're just a part of the backlash. It's
they're kind of in the background of like of the mainstream now, that right, like they're not major players in that way. Yeah, not major players, but they're not the main character.
Exactly. Their plight, and I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I'm a Black woman, and the only experience that I have is my experience, and the way that I view the world, and the way that I experience the world, and my journey is going to be different from your journey. And I think the biggest plight that Black people or African Americans, the biggest thing that we are just trying to get people to see, it's really just see. You have to see what we're seeing. You have to see what we're experiencing, what we're trying to say to you. It's never important to anyone else until it happens to you. And this thing that is going on in the Asian community, I know that there's a lot going on with the Black Lives Matter movement. We have, this argument going on that's saying that, well, you all need to be as on board with the Asian Lives Matters like you were with the Black Lives Matter, and then you have this group of people that are saying, well, where were you all when we were having this big thing play out on stage with all of the Black people who were or anybody who supported that movement? Where were your voices? Where were you all at when we needed you? But you want us to be in solidarity now that there are attacks being perpetuated, or being you're being victimized in the Asian community. So you've got this narrative where we're losing focus. What's the common denominator in this? It is the white supremacist movement. And once again, they're puppeteering everything. They're making the issue a Black and Asian thing.
Yeah. And I think
it's not.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to, I was talking about the model minority myth, which again is a tool, right, to pit communities against each other, when we know for sure that the only way out of these systems is to have a coalition together, to move forward together.
Exactly.
But at the same time, I also do think about I also do think about how, yes, unity is very important, but I also think healing is very important as well, because all communities do have a lot of history of both collaboration and working together, but I think there's also a lot of hurt. And I think the only way to move forward is to heal that hurt. And, you bring up that point of like that, and, like kind of how I was saying earlier when the protest was happening last year and everything that's been going on has finally like elevated these topics into like the mainstream conversation. And I remember feeling like, oh, finally, like you're late to the party. But again, I always say like, I'm glad that you're joining. I'm glad that you have, you're having these conversations. Again, it's better late than never. And when I think about like the, like folks saying like, oh, well, was the community last year, and then vice versa, like, oh, why is that not the community coming up and showing up doing like the Stop Asian Hate movement that's happening right now? I think it kind of goes back to, again, this erasure of our history of our communities collaborating together, because there's a deep history of that. And I think also perhaps, again, the model minority myth being a structure that prevents us from healing that hurt as well. I think one way to like really, like, I struggle with how do we come together and move forward, because again, people are in different paths, people are in different places of learning, they're in different places of self-discovery, and it's a lot of work to be, I think, like, it's a lot of work. I think like when someone has just joined in on the journey and you have spent years in it, right? And I think a lot about how like in the Black community, there's a long history of activism. There's a long history of organization, and has influenced a lot of communities' organization, like our own history of like organizing and collaborating as well. And, I think to say that like the Asian American community doesn't have that history is, I think, a little bit too simplistic. I think we do have that history. We have history of working together. I think it goes back to this erasure though. Like I always think about how it wasn't till I was in college I learned about Filipino agricultural workers working together with the Chicano like agricultural movement in California, and that Filipinos were like a founding group in the United Farm Workers movement, right? Like I always think of that history, how I never learned about that like when I was younger. Like that's not in the history books. That's not taught in school. And again, I think there's that erasure of history that's going on that, yeah.
I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to cut your thought off, but
it's okay.
You are so right. It's like, I didn't know that, those, I think, we're in a melting pot, and I enjoy meeting and talking to people from, I don't care where you're from. I enjoy having the conversation and getting to know what life was like for you. I'm not always talking about sob stories. It doesn't have to be these broken-hearted stories. We have so much to learn from one another. There's just so much out there, and it's it's boring to only see one story, one narrative. There's so much out there. There's a wealth of information. There are so many groups of people. We can just learn so much from one another. And you're so right. The erasure. I only think about my history and how we don't learn about our history. And I think about, maybe if people understood and they knew our history, that, or even us, if we knew our history, that pain it wouldn't be there. This sense of being lost and trying to navigate yourself somewhere where you don't feel like you belong. Sometimes it feels like, well, maybe if we expose these things, maybe minds will change. Maybe behaviors will change. But I would love to learn about different cultures, traditions, their back. I just think it makes for a more well-rounded experience, and maybe you won't judge people. So, I mean, because we're different, we're never intended to be the same.
It's a more like full reality, right?
Exactly.
Like, it's not so one-sided. It's when you, I think, learn about other people's lived realities and acknowledge and validate like these lived realities are very much, even though that's not my lived reality. I think like when we learn histories and people and how people are truly like living in their own experiences, and then it's kind of accepted as like truth. I think then you have a fuller life that way.
And you see people, as human. It wouldn't be those people. You know what I mean? Things wouldn't be, you wouldn't exclude or reduce the light. It wouldn't be so easy to try to make light of another group's purpose, their existence. You would treat people fairly. I mean, I would only assume, the more you learn and know about something or a person, that person becomes human to you. Or they should be. Now I know more about this. Yeah, that's the idea. They should be more human. And I would be empathetic if something happened. If I heard that there was a little village somewhere on the other side of the world, and we see all of these little marathons, just donate 20 cents a day to make sure that they have food. I mean, to me, you are correct. There is a healing that needs to be done. There's also some accountability on all of us, but I believe the fact that people's true history, no matter how hurtful it might be, or full it might be, I think if people's histories weren't hidden from them and deliberately kept, not only for you, that being your culture, that being your people, that being your identity, it not only being hidden from you, but also being hidden from other people. Because there's a human element here. There's a difference, but there are some similarities. And when I look and I know about these people's triumphs, their failures, there's a sense of pride. There's a sense of belonging. There's a sense of awareness, security, even because you don't feel lost. And I agree. Yeah. We definitely need to soul search. And unfortunately, because history is so exclusive or non-inclusive, and then when they do grant, give you a moment, it's like these little bitty pieces of things that we keep recycling every year, keep hearing about every year. So you don't really know how great and how strong and how productive and how your people have contributed wherever they are.
And I think also like having just like a nuanced understanding of history too, right? Like, and having like history that's also like living history. I think a lot about how when it comes to Asian American history in particular, like at least in my experience, I like grew up in like the California education system, and like of course we learned about the Transcontinental Railroad. We learned about the Japanese internment camps, which, to caveat that, when I was a grad student at UT and I was going over a short story that was about the Japanese American experience during World War II and the internment camps, someone asked me if that happened. And I asked the class if who learned about the Japanese internment camps in high school, middle school. Only maybe in the class of like 25, 30 kids, maybe 5 students raised their hand and said they learned about it. And that to me, like I remember my heart sinking, and I was just like, this was such a major scar, like on U.S. history, and like it wasn't covered. And much in the same way that slavery is being like people like publishers and folks are trying to diminish that story in the history books, right? And but again, so I'm thinking like how at least in my educational experience, it was like, okay, he was a transcontinental railroad, he was a Japanese American internment camps, and then vaguely, references about the Vietnamese refugees from Vietnam. And then that was it. That was like kind of really what I learned about the Asian American history. And it wasn't that very nuanced. It was very much in the past. It doesn't show that like the lived experiences, how that impacted generations moving forward. When it comes, I think, to like learning our histories, I think it has to be a deeper dive. And I don't think like all communities are really given that opportunity in that space, I think, to learn, especially in the education system. And so, I mean, again, that's why when I was like in grad school and I was like, well, I'm just going to go into the community instead, because I just was very, I don't know, I was very disappointed, and I was like, well, if I really do think educating the community is gonna be where we, like I was mentioning, kind of heal past trauma and build bridges. I'm going to be able to do it in the community. I'm not going to be able to do it, honestly, in the classroom.
I mean, and that's true, because you have to rely on the elders, you have to rely. I mean, there was a time where these, I don't want to call them stories because they're accounts. Mm-hmm. There was a time where these things were passed down, but we relied on the elders in the community, to pass these stories down. And it was intended. It was very important that those elements of history, whether it was your family history or your community's history, or your people's history, it was important. And they did it around the dinner table. When we ate, we shared these stories of our history, or before we would go to bed. Mm-hmm. We knew who these individuals were, and we passed it down. But, we've gotten to a point to where if the elders didn't keep it going, nobody else took that responsibility. Mm-hmm. And so we don't have the true stories. It was all verbal, it was all, it wasn't written down. We were relying off of just the memories and all of these accounts that were verbally passed down, and no one thought to record it. I mean, some people did, they recorded what they could, but that's something that is left up to the family unit or the community, because you can't expect someone else to, one, treat your history with the respect and the truth and how it actually occurred, because someone else is going to spin their own story because they might think, well, I've got to add this element to it to make it more exciting.
Well, again, I think that's like all stories being told through right lenses, right? Like, so right before Atlanta happened, there was an author I really like, Kathy Park Hong. She wrote Minor Feelings, an Asian American Reckoning or Awakening. I think it was Reckoning. But anyways, there was this interview I was reading from her, and she was just talking about like all stories are still told through whiteness. Nobody really knows us. And I think a lot about like this idea of, seeing myself as a community educator, and, working with folks in the community. I think like we are empowered to preserve our own stories, to share our own stories in a way that's going to be more authentic.
Right.
And that's, like not told through this lens of whiteness. And I think like that, like I think a lot of it is we've been, again, like my parents were like, oh, become a doctor and lawyer, you go to university, you go and do all these things. We were being told like, oh, these are the ways to validate knowledge and facts and whatnot. But really, us as a community, we've been doing this for a while. We just need to preserve it and share it as well. So that all communities know about each other's histories in a way that is not being filtered through the media and filtered through the history textbooks as, all these are biased. And, all communities might be biased, but at least it's being told authentically through us.
There you go. I agree. And you know what? I want to say thank you so much, Leila Grace, for accepting the invitation. This has been a great conversation. It's been.
I'm glad.
I'm enjoying. No. I enjoy your perspective. Because like you just said, I want the authentic version of whoever it is you are and wherever it is you came from. I may never meet anyone else. And this would be my first interaction with someone, you're Filipino American. Am I correct?
Yeah.
I may never have another discussion with a Filipino American again. And when we have this discussion, again, I always say when I talk with people, either I'm going to leave the discussion empowered and informed, or I definitely want the other person to leave, or whoever's in earshot of what it is whatever it is we're talking about. I want someone to leave empowered or informed, because why else are we talking? If you're not saying something that is meaningful, and like you said, I love that you chose the word authentic. And the only person that can tell an authentic story is you. So I enjoyed our conversation. I think it's amazing. You saying, just the lenses, the accounts of our lives, it definitely needs to be journaled or documented correctly. It also needs to be authentic. It needs to be true. And it needs to be from the people who actually know. Can't let other people tell our stories. And if they do, they need to tell it right. The only way they could tell it right as well is if all own storytelling gets shouted out, right? Because how will folks know what's the authentic, what's a quote unquote like authentic story if they aren't exposed to it? Not to be so simplistic, but I always think about how when I was at that law school summer camp at Stanford, and there was like all these kids from around the country, and someone was like, oh yeah, like my favorite Asian food is Panda Express. And I remember thinking like, that's not it, girl. That's not.
I'm like, that's not it. But at the same time, I'm like, well, how would she know she wasn't exposed to other types of food? Like, in retrospect, like I look back, I'm like, she didn't have the exposure to, like, she didn't have the diversity that I had, that I was exposed to growing up in Los Angeles. And that's, that wasn't her fault. And the fault is again, just like not like folks not exposing her to different experiences, different stories, different food, right? Like,
yeah, but
I think that's
you have people who say, well, okay, but she's now an adult. Isn't it their response? Is it now that you're an adult, it's your responsibility now to no longer fly in the veil of ignorance. If you really and truly want to know something, I mean, like you said, I wished I could Google that. I mean, we have Google.
We do. I could just actually Google the name.
Exactly. So it's like, how can you continue to fly under the veil or the excuse, well, I didn't know? I mean, and I'm at a point now where ignorance, there's no reason for you to continue to be ignorant. I don't care how you were raised. You're going to encounter different people, different conversations, different experiences. And if you really and truly want to know the truth about it, You need to go research for yourself. Hopefully the information that comes to you, hopefully it is true. I'm going to say something. I'm going to tell you. Hopefully, yes, the resources are factual. Here recently, my daughters and I have 3 adult daughters now, and we recently watched Mulan.
The live action one?
Yes. Okay. So I know that there was a huge controversy about Mulan and some of the historical facts about Mulan. They weren't there, and there was just a big controversy. So we looked up Mulan, and from what I found out about it, it's unclear as to whether or not Mulan was actually a person. If she was really true, or if it was just another folklore passed down. There's a story behind it. So some people are saying it was told to generations because there was a story that women can ultimately do the same thing as men, open these doors, basically. But in us researching Mulan and whether or not Mulan was true, we went back to all of the lullabies, or the children's stories. When I read about Sleeping Beauty, the true story about Sleeping Beauty is not what Disney portrayed. It was terrible. And I'm like, we're sitting up and we're spoon feeding our children these beautiful stories, and they're not true. When you read the true origin of Sleeping Beauty, she was asleep. She was knocked out.
But she was sexually assaulted
by a king who couldn't wake her, and ultimately impregnated her. I mean, it's like, oh my gosh.
It was originally sold as a cautionary tale, and then got twisted to a romance story.
And there was nothing romantic. And I kept reading, and that story never got better. I mean, his wife found out, and she wanted to feed the twins to him. I'm just like, we have to get out of this Pollyanna. And I know we're trying, the intent is to protect children and to let them know that, all life isn't bad and true love is real. We want to protect them from the realities, the harsh realities, but don't do it with stories like that.
No.
It was great. And we went through all of them, and I'm just like, this is terrible. I didn't.
I mean, again, I think it's going back to authentic storytelling that isn't about fairy tales,
right?
And there's a way to tell authentic experiences to kids that isn't going to rely on these fairy tale tropes. I think there's a new crop of children's books coming out that I think will speak more to kids, rather than upholding a certain fantasy. Right. Unrealistic. It goes back to dismantling myths. I think that's myths all part of the system. But we have to stop perpetuating them. And we do, and these conversations like what you and I are having, after I had that conversation, it was just curiosity, right? I'm just like, I don't know Mulan. I don't know if it's true. I can't speak against Asian culture. I'm not studied enough to say that's true or this is factual or no, that's terrible. So I have to go and look, or I have to find someone who is familiar, preferably someone who knows the culture. But having this discussion and moving from Mulan and reading about all of these stories, that the bedtime stories and the Disney. You realize it was happening all over. Oh my gosh, right? And it's a systemic thing. It's that's what I'm saying. It's threaded, it's sewn in, and it's so deep. You've got to change so much. But when we have these conversations and we unravel, and no matter how hard the truth is to hear,
you now can make a decision, an informed decision on what you're going to do with this information. Now, my daughter said that they're not going to tell these stories. They're not going to, when they do have their own children. Those are the things, they're not going to let their children grow up watching these things and believing that every woman's gonna be a princess and fall in love. There's and have
be this Prince Charming coming to risking them away.
We're gonna be realistic, and like you said, you've got authors who also found these terrible things out, these truths, and they're like, you know what? There's a better way to tell this story. There's a realistic way so that I can raise children who have a more realistic view, but still can stay children, because I think that's important as well.
I agree. Yeah,
you cannot expose children to too much, and that is very, very important. Let a child be a child. Let them imagine and dream, but
this is when they develop empathy, right? Like very young, and so I think keeping it so that storytelling and it still is in a way is teaching them all these like useful things, but in a way that's going to make it realistic. And again, not upholding something
false. False expectations.
False expectations.
We can't do that. We definitely want to make productive, hopefully adults and like you said, empathetic, really, if nothing else. A new crop. Thank you so much. It has been amazing. I thank you for accepting the invitation. You're welcome back at any time.
Thank you for inviting me, and shout out to you and Janelle for having to piece together my confusing thoughts.
No, hey, I love it. This is the conversation we have. I understood it, but you have a good rest of your day. Yeah. Thank you again for participating, and you're welcome back anytime.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
You have a good weekend, and I'll hear from you soon.
All right. Take care. We've come to the close of another episode of the End User Talk podcast. I hope that what you've heard today will leave you feeling empowered. Thank you for listening. And remember, every day's a training day.